Hello. The title of this lecture is The Underground Church. The Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, Repression, claims that communist regimes were criminal enterprises in their very essence, carrying out the planned killing of at least 85 million people in the 20th century. Atheistic communism was not a benign system that took a mythical wrong turn under the direction of any particular brutal leader. Rather, its goal from start to finish was to crush all class enemies. Atheistic communist leaders recognized the threat of Christianity, the biggest religion in the world. Communist leadership understood that it was vital for people to be loyal to the state and not any religion. Although communism became a much weaker force after 1990, persecution of Christians persisted in the 21st century. There were many examples of Christians forced to worship in underground churches in authoritarian nations. The rise of house churches in 21st century China, for example, is a fascinating account of Christians persevering despite significant challenges from government forces. Surprisingly, churches in Western democracies have recently experienced a level of pressure from governments that was unheard of before the year 2020. In the last century, countless Christians experienced persecution on many levels. In the Soviet Union, school children had to wear a badge with the portrait of Lenin and a red scarf. Yuri Sipko was one student who refused. Quote, "I was a Baptist. I wasn't going to do that." His teacher confronted his mother, stating that he was refusing to accept state-mandated lessons in atheism. Life for this particular family was difficult. Yuri's father had been sent to prison for 5 years for the crime of preaching the gospel. Yuri explained, "Baptists were mocked and ridiculed in society. Sometimes they even lost their children. Just because they were Baptists, the state was willing to take away their kids and send them to orphanages. These believers were unable to find jobs. Their children were not able to enter universities, and still they believed." In his book, Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents, Rod Dreher writes, quote, "To be a Baptist in Soviet Russia was to know that you were a permanent outsider. They endured it because they knew that truth was embodied in Jesus Christ, and to live apart from him would mean living a lie. For the Baptist to compromise with lies for the sake of a peaceful life is to bend at the knee to death." End of quote. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Baptists continued to experience marginalization. In addition to Baptists, there were many other Christians who suffered greatly. Alexander Ogorodnikov was a former communist who accepted Christianity. When he campaigned for religious liberty, the state threw him in prison. There, a guard on the brink of insanity confessed to Ogorodnikov of witnessing a horrific execution. Quote, One of the KGB guys walked up to the first priest. He asked him very calmly and quietly, "Is there a God?" The priest said yes. They shot him in the forehead in such a way that his brains covered the priest standing behind him. He calmly loaded his pistol, went to the next priest, and asked, "Does God exist?" "Yes, he exists." The KGB man shot this priest in the same way. We didn't blindfold them. They saw everything that was about to happen to them. Just a horrific experience, and this had adversely affected one of the guards. There are no shortage of stories of persecution in other totalitarian regimes. Vaclav Benda was a devout Catholic who went to prison in Czechoslovakia for fighting for human rights. For him, the underground Catholic Church was instrumental for those who opposed communist rule. After his death, Markita, one of his daughters, stated, quote, "He acted in sight of God. And you know, the Bible gave him strength because it is full of stories of the prophets and others going beyond the border of what was comprehensible or understandable to people for the sake of obeying the Lord." End of quote. Another shocking example of Christian dissent was the case of Father Jerzy Popieluszko, the chaplain of Poland's trade union called Solidarity. The Catholic priest received numerous threats to his life, and in 1984, the secret police murdered him and threw his body in the river. The ordeal for Christians in communist China was also horrible. American newspapers reported that many competent observers believed that China as a communist dictatorship was more dangerous to the Bible and to human freedom than the Soviet Union could ever be. Evangelical literature of the 1950s and 1960s told of Chinese pastors stoned to death for opposing reform. A female evangelist pulled apart by horses sent running in opposite directions. And the torturing of Christians by various methods. One of them was forcing water down their throats until their stomachs bulged. Seeing Christianity as a threat to public order, Chinese communist leaders in recent years have sought to discourage the growth of churches. For example, in December of 2001, the government executed 2 fundamentalist Protestant leaders and arrested a Hong Kong businessman who smuggled over 30,000 Bibles to a house church. But the government could not stop the growing interest in biblical Christianity. In the summer of 2004, there were a series of open-air evangelistic campaigns, with the last meeting attracting more than 10,000 people. The organizers set up a mobile stage off a highway and rolled out cinema-style speaker systems. One scholar describes the scene, quote, "Defying an army of security personnel who blocked off the site, the local lay preachers cried out messages of repentance on stage while women holding babies were deployed as human shields against fire engines that the police had dispatched. In the end, the authorities let the meeting proceed without incident, and it did not make news." This brand of Christianity according to scholar Lian Qi, offered a potent mix of evangelistic fervor, biblical literalism, charismatic aestheses, and a fiery eschatology. This was taking place in many regions of China. In the summer of 2006, paramilitary police stormed a rural Protestant church in eastern China. There were about 3,000 members of the local unregistered little flock congregations. This congregation, again, the name of this group was Little Flock, and they had gathered there to protect the building. Well, in the end, the police injured many and arrested dozens. With heavy equipment, the police demolished the church. The event garnered international attention. Time magazine viewed the episode as unmistakable evidence of flourishing Christianity in China. After many failures by foreign missionaries to gain a foothold in China, Christianity, quote, is finally taking root and evolving into a truly Chinese religion. Illegal churches, some destroyed by the government more than once, kept returning. One stadium-sized building could seat more than 5,000 people. Scholars have done excellent work on the rise of the house church in China. Joseph Lee provides helpful definitions. The underground church is not literally underground. Services are not in caves. An underground church is one without proper government registration. The term house church does not refer to a religious meeting in a single household. Because underground churches and house churches are unregistered, communist officials resort to state surveillance and monitoring. There is speculation that the population of Chinese Christians could be as high as 130 million, but no one knows for sure. Most Chinese Christians belong to house churches, which cannot be counted. Their private services are illegal. State churches, which are officially recognized, tend to be hostile towards house churches. The Protestant state churches have connections with the Christian three self-patriotic movements. Another one is the China Christian Council. These two state-controlled entities have no sympathy for any unofficial religious activity. Theologian Richard Zhang identified how the three self-patriotic movement fell short in creating self-supporting and self-propagating Chinese churches. Quote, many people both in China and abroad think that the Protestant church in China now is tightly grasped by the government than ever before. Of course, this church is usually referred to as the recognized church. The point self should be understood in the sense of the church or the Christians of the local community. If the church is dependent on the government, the result is no better than being dependent on former foreign missions. Therefore, if the three self principle is adhered to in the future, the emphasis should be on the church's independence from internal as well as external interference, no matter in what name such interference is exercised. Scholar Carrie Kosil outlines important characteristics of the house churches. House churches have the advantage of having popular, charismatic preachers and dedicated followers. However, there are obstacles for church growth. The house churches represent a significant threat to the government, which demands obedience. For security reasons, the house churches often have to change locations and be wary of new visitors who might be government spies seeking to shut down the church. Although it occurs, door-to-door evangelism is illegal. Media advertising is outlawed, and the house church depends solely on the financial support of members. Scholars have presented several theories to explain the growth of house churches despite the state repression. Some claim that when Marxist ideology declined in the post-Mao era, there was a values vacuum filled by Christianity. Some suggest that there is a lessening of militant atheism in China. Others see Christianity as a way people can cope with the rising inequality of Chinese society. The argument is that Chinese social services were inadequate and that the caring and giving components of house churches were attractive features. Some point to the fact that the house churches had a good base. They had continued to operate when the official churches were shut down during repressive periods such as the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and early 1970s. Other scholars see Christianity as a vehicle for upward mobility. All these secular-based interpretations have been around for 100 years. They've been applied to Europe, the Americas, and other regions of the world. More convincing are spiritual explanations of people embracing a message of sin and salvation. House churches tend to be biblical churches. There are the promises of living for Christ and prophecy, and there's a focus on the gifts of the Holy Spirit in many of these churches. There are exciting aspects such as faith healing and the power of prayer. One example of a thriving house church is the China Gospel Fellowship, estimated to have as many as 7 million members. The church has Pentecostal leanings, and some services have members speaking in tongues. Many of the early leaders found Christ during the Cultural Revolution. The story of Pastor Chen is an interesting one. When he was a young man, an illness caused paralysis to his legs, and doctors gave him about 1 year to live. A Catholic neighbor offered to pray for healing, but Chen was skeptical. Well, the neighbor persisted, and after a number of days of prayer, Chen began to have feelings in his legs. A few weeks later, he was walking, and then after he gave his life to Jesus. The word got out about this miracle, and people began visiting his home. People began exchanging and sharing Bible passages and hymn lyrics. Chen's house grew, and he and other members traveled around the countryside sharing the gospel. These missionary teams discovered that an effective method was to visit villages and towns under the guise of laborers and then develop social networks. They knocked on doors looking for people who were open to the gospel, or they went to the fields and did manual work. While working in the fields, they told Bible stories and they sang hymns. The next step was inviting the villagers to informal services later in the evening. Once the groundwork was done in the village, the missionary team moved to the next village. The process could take a little longer in the larger villages and towns. In a large village, they might form up to 20 house churches. Complementing the house churches were numerous cell groups. Some Christians joined a state church with the intention of stealing sheep, a tactic that upset state church ministers. When there were political raids, the authorities demanded that the house church disband. The fine for sharing the gospel was severe, equaling 1 year's income for members and 4 years' income for a church leader. Often, missionary teams received sentences to labor camps for proper re-education. Some preachers were in the labor camps up to 15 years. When a house church experienced hostility from the government, cell groups could fill in the vacuum with services that did not attract attention. Evangelistic work in larger cities was key, especially since many rural people were migrating to large urban centers. One leader claimed, quote, "Even in the cities, we are still a rural church." Urban tactics were different than countryside tactics. In the cities, team members did evangelism inside factories. They became model workers and gained the trust of fellow workers. If factory managers learned of the evangelism, the workers were rarely fired because they established themselves as honest and hardworking. The moral authority of hard work brought effective results for the evangelists. Organization was another key factor in the cities. To reduce government interference, the church created semi-autonomous branches and isolating levels of the church hierarchy from one another. As for the China Gospel Fellowship, it has 6 levels. At the top is the uncle, who was the head of the church. A lower council elects this position. The Council of Elders is the second level of the church, composed of the uncle and about 7 elders. It has many responsibilities, including administration, business, fundraising, missionary work, education, and pastoral care. The group, composed of men and women, vote on all major decisions. The next level are district churches. A district covers a territory with at least 30,000 baptized members. Each district is led by a church elder and 3 to 6 deacons. The staff are well-trained in church affairs, and many of them had paid the price of being sent to labor camps. The 4th level are the local churches. In each district, there are usually about 3 to 4 local churches. In addition to coordinating large worship services once or twice a month, the local church provides a support network for house churches and cell groups. The 5th level is the house church. The house church is the foundation of the China Gospel Fellowship. Each typically have 3 leaders: preacher, music leader, and accountant. Most services are held in private homes, but there are also services in barns, fields, or offices and apartments in the city. The average number of members is 30, but there are some as large as 150 baptized members. Usually when a house church reaches 40 regular attendees, the congregation is divided to form another house church. Because a house church is relatively contained and independent, any government raid will not be a serious blow to the larger organization. The final level consists of the cell groups. A cell group is quite small with only 7 to 15 members. Some might consist of only women, or it could be another cell group of only young people. Each cell group is connected to a particular house church. All 6 levels of the China Gospel Fellowship are insulated from each other, as I had mentioned earlier, which allows them to reorganize when government takes repressive measures. China consists of an authoritarian society where the state equates religious identification with political and ideological loyalty. The communist government remains hostile towards any religious expression outside of the control of the one-party state. The China Gospel Fellowship enhances integrity by focusing on the gospel and staying clear of politics. With no interest in challenging or replacing the existing political order, the organization builds on reaching others with the gospel. Of course, history reveals that when a government gets in the way of those who are doing God's business, Christians have taken a greater role in contesting a repressive state. But in the case of China, it would be where the government will destroy a church, but the members will just relocate, start all over again, rebuild, and this is the way that they keep going. They are not out to change the communist government. In Western democratic nations, where religious freedom is pretty much protected in when we think of the West, when we think of Europe and the Americas and other regions where we have democracies, the story is different. It was rare to see governments using heavy-handed or being heavy-handed with churches. However, COVID-19 changed that. One example of the government clashing with a Christian church in the West is the case of California versus a large evangelical church. In the summer of 2020, Pastor John MacArthur of the Grace Community Church, located in the Sun Valley neighborhood of Los Angeles, defied COVID-19 public health orders that banned indoor religious services. Although the church initially followed health orders and closed for a few weeks, so that our story would begin, it was back in March 2020, March and April, in this period, they did close down, but the church reopened and continued services with church attendees singing and sitting without masks. When Los Angeles County health inspectors tried to enter the church, they were blocked by private security guards. In July 2020, Pastor MacArthur addressed Romans 13 and other verses from the New Testament, basically addressing Paul's command to be subject to governing authorities. And this was what Pastor MacArthur's position was. Quote, while civil government is invested with divine authority to rule the state, neither of those texts nor any other grants civic rulers jurisdiction over the church. God has established three institutions within human society: the family, the state, and the church. Each institution has a sphere of authority with jurisdictional limits that must be respected. A father's authority is limited to his own family. Church leaders' authority, which is delegated to them by Christ, is limited to church matters. And government is specifically tasked with the oversight and protection of civic peace and well-being within the boundaries of a nation or community. God has not granted civic rulers authority over the doctrine, practice, or polity of the church. The biblical framework limits the authority of each institution to its specific jurisdiction. The church does not have the right to meddle in the affairs of individual families and ignore parental authority. Parents do not have authority to manage civil matters while circumventing government officials. And similarly, government officials have no right to interfere in ecclesiastical matters in a way that undermines or disregards the God-given authority of pastors and elders. These were the key sentences of his statement, but he actually had more to say about it, and this material is posted on the website of the church. In the following month, attorneys representing the church filed a suit against California government Gavin Newsom and the other officials. The attorneys argued that the government's policies restricted religious freedom. In winter 2021, the pastor, who was 81 years old, so John MacArthur is 81 years old, he contracted COVID and was ill for 1.5 weeks. His wife also got COVID. And MacArthur admitted others got sick. And he stated that COVID basically went through the church in the December 2020 or January 2021 months. But again, you could go to the church, and many did go. In fact, the attendance was quite remarkable, but people were crowding in, sitting side by side, singing, talking to each other, and most apparently were not wearing masks. They did not have to wear masks. In February of 2021, the US Supreme Court ruled that California was wrong to enforce a ban on indoor worship because of COVID. Thus, California lost its case against the church, and it had to pay out a $800,000 settlement. MacArthur responded, telling congregants that, quote, the natural immunity that God has designed is the greatest protection, end of quote. He added that, quote, God has a way of taking care of us as we love each other and share our germs, end of quote. The settlement, that is the $800,000, went to the Thomas More Society, which had represented the church in court. In late August 2021, MacArthur stated that, quote, "Nothing will come to us except the affirmation that the Lord preserved and protected us through this." And there were other churches in America that took a similar stand, where they just continued the services, believing that the health professionals were not giving the complete story on what was happening with COVID, and particularly the vaccines. In other cases, pastors went to jail for ignoring restrictions on worship. For example, the Alberta government in Canada sent Pastor James Coates of Grace Life Church, located near the city of Edmonton. The government sent the pastor to jail for over a month for not closing in-person services. And there were, as was the case in the United States, there were other provinces. So we got Alberta, but there were other provinces where pastors actually did go to jail. And another option was that there were pastors who adopted the strategy of underground churches. So what is common in communist China and other regions where authoritarianism is strong was happening in democratic countries such as the United States, Canada, and other actually democratic countries in the world. So how it worked was by word of mouth, people would discover that there were unofficial church services available for people wanting to gather, sing, and worship without wearing a mask. Now, this had to be done all very carefully because these underground churches were, in essence, defying health measures. As a result of COVID-19, there is a new field of there's a new field of study of Western governments closing or restricting churches. So scholars in the West examining state suppression of Christianity do not have to look any further than their own communities. But there's certainly no consensus on this episode in Western democracies. The church is divided on what was the proper and biblical path to take. Thank you.